On November 17, 1973, Rolling Stone journalist Craig Copetis performed the role of a fly on the wall whilst documenting a two-way interview between beat writer William S. Burroughs and musician David Bowie. The interview took place at Bowie's residence in London, and more specifically, in his science fiction themed living room, where the two men discussed a range of topics relating to love, sexuality, the media, spiritualism, and unsurprisingly, writing. The two hit it off immediately, despite knowing very little about each other's work. Bowie had read Burroughs' 1964 novel Nova Express, and Burroughs had listened to 2 tracks from Bowie's 1972 album The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and The Spiders from Mars. The 2 songs were 5 Years and Starman. Burroughs had also taken the time to read through all of Bowie's lyrics, and it was this component of Bowie's work that had intrigued Burroughs the most, as the preceding 2-hour interview mainly highlighted the process, inspiration, and meaning behind the words Bowie sang. Finding what felt like an unusual relatability between the two men, at the end of the interview the pair went their separate ways, but kept in contact. Copetis, on the other hand, knowing he had just witnessed a historic conversation, went home and wrote up the transcript of the two men's dialogue, which was later featured in the February 28, 1974 issue of Rolling Stone. David Bowie was no stranger to transformation. In a musical career spanning 6 decades, Bowie had proved time and time again that he was one of the rare species in any medium of art that was capable of avoiding the all too common trap of stagnation. We look back fondly on many musicians that had reached the pinnacle of success and provided us with classic songs, perfect albums, iconic live performances, and even whole new genres. These songs, albums, performances, and genres are new and exciting at the time, and are still something to marvel at years after the fact, but it usually stops there. What typically occurs as the years move away from a musician's initial breakthrough are feeble attempts by the musician at recapturing the feeling of musically defining a generation. And as these feeble attempts fail time and time again, the musician in question merely becomes a relic of the past. Punk, grunge, glam rock, Britpop, you name it, all invoke a point in time and the musicians whose careers peaked and troughed within it. But this is why David Bowie is a special case, because he never peaked at one point in time. Granted, some albums were better than others, but his hits spanned the course of his career. The reason why I believe this was the case was because Bowie was a master of reinventing his sound and his image through storytelling. Throughout his career, Bowie created many personas whose stories he relayed through the medium of music. Whether it's Ziggy Stardust, Major Tom, Aladdin Sane, the Thin White Duke, etc., Bowie had found a way to envelop himself in an image and a sound for the duration of an album's composition, but then disregard that image and sound in order to create new ones when making his next album. Thus, it was hard for Bowie to become stagnant, as creating an album was not merely a case of writing a few songs. He was instead writing a whole story, and with it, the image and the musical and lyrical components that could best tell that story. When considering the influences Bowie pulled from when dealing with a story's most important component, the words, you see that Bowie looked to writers for inspiration on narratives, writing techniques, and elements of novels he could reference, to strengthen the often sci-fi infused worlds his personas resided in. And so, when we look back upon that November day in 1973, when Bowie, 26 years old and eccentrically dressed, opposite Burroughs, a simply dressed man nearing his 60s, sat down and founded an unlikely relatability between each other, it can only be assumed that their relatability towards one another was found in the fundamental goal they both shared: telling stories. Bowie's interest in music dates back as far as to when he was 13 in 1960, when he tried learning the saxophone after feeling inspired by the jazz scene of the London West End. In his adolescent years, Bowie picked up the guitar and decided he wanted to be a singer, resulting in him playing in numerous bands such as the Conrads, Davy Jones and the King Bees, the Manish Boys, and Davy Jones and the Lower Third. After the repeated commercial disappointment with these bands, Bowie took a step back from music, yet soon returned as a solo act. Bowie thus released his first album on the 1st of June 1967, titled simply David Bowie. Unfortunately, the album was overshadowed by the Beatles, who released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on the same day. Bowie's second album, once again self-titled, was released 2 years later, on November 4th, 1969. The album's lead single, Space Oddity, was its defining moment, and drew a lot of attention. However, the remainder of the album was ignored. Bowie then released his third album, The Man Who Sold the World, on the 4th of November 1970. Once again, the album was largely ignored. The last of this trend of commercial failure would occur in Bowie's fourth album, Hunky Dory, released on the 17th of December 1971. The third track off Hunky Dory, called 8-Line Poem, would later become a brief talking point between Bowie and Burroughs during their interview, as Burroughs was convinced Bowie had been inspired lyrically by a poem from writer T.S. Eliot called The Wasteland. Burroughs had seen similarities between the poem and Bowie's song, yet upon asking Bowie whether his suspicions were true, Bowie responded that he had never heard of T.S. Eliot nor The Wasteland. This attempt at connecting a literary nod to Bowie's work by Burroughs may have been incorrect this time. However, Bowie had used literary works for inspiration early in his career. For example, the title of the song, The Man Who Sold the World, was inspired by the 1949 science fiction novel The Man Who Sold the Moon by Robert Heinlein. Additionally, the content of the lyrics to the song was inspired by the poem Antigonish by Hughes Mearns. As well as giving literary nods in his early work, Bowie had also begun flirting with making characters. This is most notably shown in his first hit single, Space Oddity, which features the character Major Tom, a character Bowie would reference again in later releases. When looking back on these first 4 releases, a good portion of the songs are stories, yet Bowie hadn't fully embraced a singular character throughout a full album, like he would on his 5th album, the album that shot his name into stardom, which was titled The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. But before we go into the story of Ziggy Stardust, let's go back to the reading habits that developed Bowie's love of narratives and language. Bowie always expressed that his perfect idea of happiness was reading. Reading had become a pleasurable pastime for Bowie since reading the Beano comics as a child. As he grew older, he transitioned to Penguin Classics paperbacks. Bowie would carry what he thought to be trendy books around with him during his adolescent years too. These trendy books were given to him by his half-brother, who introduced him to many writers, but most notably to Jack Kerouac and his classic On the Road. However, whilst the beat literature of Kerouac and many others had a long-lasting impression on Bowie, what held the biggest influence was science fiction. When Bowie was growing up in the 1950s, interest in science fiction was at an all-time high due to developments in technology at the time that pushed people towards fantasizing about the possibilities of such high tech. Bowie was no exception to this interest, as he had frequently mentioned his love for books related to sci-fi, and particularly books by Robert Heinlein. This interest would seep its way into Bowie's music in songs like Space Oddity, and also the 1967 song Karma Man, which references Ray Bradbury's 1951 science fiction novel The Illustrated Man in the lyrics. Bowie would thus take inspiration from his sci-fi influences when creating the character of Ziggy Stardust for his 5th album. The design of Ziggy Stardust was half taken from the characters in Burroughs' novel The Wild Boys, and the characters in Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. In the interview between Bowie and Burroughs, the two discussed the character of Ziggy Stardust, prompting Burroughs to ask Bowie to clarify the story of the character. Bowie explains how Ziggy Stardust comes down to Earth just as the population are told that the world only has 5 years until it ends, due to a lack of natural resources. In short, Ziggy Stardust, who is sent down to Earth to tell the people of a Starman, eventually becomes a prophet to the frightened population. The story ends with the Infinites, which are formless higher beings, coming down to Earth and tearing off pieces of Ziggy's elements to make themselves visible to the populace. As soon as Ziggy dies on stage, the Infinites take his elements and make themselves visible. It is a science fiction fantasy of today, and this is what literally blew my head off when I read Nova Express, which was written in 1961. Evidently, the science fiction of the 1950s influenced Bowie massively on his fifth album. However, there was one sci-fi book that would remain an influence throughout Bowie's entire life, and which is referenced in the 10th track of The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. The book in question was the aforementioned 1962 Anthony Burgess dystopian novel, A Clockwork Orange, and the song the book is referenced in is called Suffragette City. Suffragette City originally appeared on the B-side of the lead single, Starman. The song is reminiscent of the Velvet Underground, both musically and lyrically, and it is likely they were a direct influence on Bowie, seeing as he was a fan of Lou Reed's work during the early 1970s. Bowie was particularly an admirer of Reed as a writer, and he would later expand on his admiration for Reed in the interview with Burroughs when he said, "Lou Reed is the most important, definitive writer in modern rock. Not because of the stuff that he does, but the direction that he will take it. Half the new bands would not be around if it were not for Lou. The movement that Lou's stuff has created is amazing. New York City is Lou Reed. Lou writes in the street gut level, and the English tend to intellectualize more." The direction Bowie refers to in this quote is referring to Reed's experimentation in his lyrics. Reed's unapologetic handling of taboo subjects influenced Bowie's own handling of these subjects, as is evidenced in Suffragette City, a song about a bisexual man who has switched back to sleeping with women after meeting a woman who is sexually liberated. But where the literary influences lie is in the third verse of the song, when Bowie sings the lines, "Dear Droogie, don't crash here." The word droogie is a reference to the fictional language of Nadsat, used by the youths in Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. Nadsat is the language used by the protagonist Alex, who narrates his story of being the leader of a gang of youths who terrorize their near-future dystopian city. Nadsat's language is Russian-influenced English, spliced with Cockney rhyming slang, some German, and some made-up words. Alex speaks this language throughout the entire novel. Here is an excerpt from the beginning of the novel to get an idea of how it sounds. "There was me, that is Alex, and my three droogs. That is Pete, Georgie, and Dim, Dim being really dim, and we sat in the Korova milk bar, making up our razadocs, what to do with the evening. A flip dark, chill winter bastard though dry." You get the idea. Thus, the word droogie means friend in Nadsat, and droogie is the word Alex uses in the book whenever he refers to his friends individually. Whilst this influence may have manifested itself in the form of a one-word reference, Bowie would continue using Nadsat in later releases, and he would lean into the language most in his final album, released on January 8th, 2016, called Black Star, on the song Girl Loves Me. Girl Loves Me is the 5th track on Black Star, and in the track, Bowie combines the language of Nadsat with Polari, a form of British slang adopted by homosexuals in the 70s. The song's structure is loose, and the direct meaning behind the lyrics is hard to decipher. They are half lamenting on Bowie's death in the bridge, whilst telling the story of a prostitute in the verse and chorus. The chorus of the song repeats the refrain, "Girl loves me," followed by a low menacing voice saying, "Hey China." China meaning woman in Nadsat. The opening verse of the song begins the story of the prostitute in the Nadsat/Polari mixed language. However, I believe the most interesting example of this combination is shown in the second verse. "You vidiot the China, Chudesny with the red rot, Lily blubbing litso fitzo, Devochka watch her garbles, Spatchko at the Roz shop, splitted dead from his deng deng, Vidi vidi at the China." To the uninitiated, this verse makes no sense, Bowie predominantly uses Nadsat words in this verse, besides the word fitzo, which is slang for somebody who likes to keep fit. Regardless, the outcome is confusing for those without a translator, so I'm going to attempt to translate these lines. When consulting the Nadsat glossary, what the verse is saying is this. You look at the woman, wonderful with her red mouth, kissing a face. Girl watch her song. Sleep at the police station. Split an old man for his money. Look at the woman. This is a rough translation. We can tell Bowie is speaking of a woman who steals and gets picked up by the police a lot, and is watched from afar by the narrator, which, considering the first verse as well, tells us he is speaking about a prostitute. However, this is somewhat inferred. The issue with Bowie's lyrics is that he often spells the Nadsat words wrong, or uses the wrong word. For example, the only word close to garbles in the book is warbles, which means song. Additionally, Bowie uses libby-lubbing and chudesny, which are spelt wrong in the official lyrics to Black Star. This means you have to fill in the blanks when translating, but in all honesty, I don't think this song was supposed to be coherent anyway. It's more about the feeling that the use of the language gives to the song. Whilst Bowie was a storyteller, he was an ambiguous one at times, and I believe his semi-use of Nadsat was more about complementing the seediness of the world he was trying to create, both narratively and sonically. Girl Loves Me is an unsettling song about Bowie's impending death, and the music reflects the uncertainty and eeriness of knowing that soon, for Bowie, he will be dead. In trying to communicate the feeling of being forced into the unknown, he uses a language that has an eerie, unintelligible tone in order to express his inability to explain what can't be explained. Additionally, the descriptions of the prostitute in the verses both work with Nadsat, as the seedy quality of her exploits wouldn't be out of place being narrated to us by Alex. I think, whilst the reference may have been small, Bowie was again using a language that fit the seediness and taboo-like nature of the content of his lyrics in Suffragette City as well, as the language does give off an immature cadence befitting of the narrator of the song. Besides these two examples, Nadsat would pop up in other works of Bowie's as well. Bowie would comment on how using fake languages could be used to build the worlds he was creating musically in an interview from 1993. The whole idea of having this phony speak thing, mock Anthony Burgess Russian speak, that drew on Russian words and put them into the English language and twisted old Shakespearean words around. This kind of fake language fitted in perfectly with what I was trying to do in creating this fake world, or this world that hadn't happened yet. Next, we have the third song from the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust, called Moonage Daydream. This song's literary influence was not so much in the story, nor is it found in a reference within the lyrics. Instead, the influence is found in the way Bowie wrote the lyrics. Coming back to the Burroughs-Bowie interview, Bowie credits Burroughs with inspiring the way Bowie was going to approach his theatrical performance of Ziggy Stardust. Nova Express really reminded me of Ziggy Stardust, which I'm going to be putting into a theatrical performance. 40 scenes are in it, and it would be nice if the characters and actors learned the scenes and we all shuffled them around in a hat the afternoon of the performance, and just performed it as the scenes come out. I got all this from you, Bill, so it would change every night. Burroughs then responded, "That's a very good idea. Visual cut up in a different sequence." What Bowie is referencing he got from Burroughs is a creative technique Burroughs is credited with popularizing called the cut-up technique. The cut-up technique is a technique in which a person can cut up a piece of text and rearrange it to create something new. The idea is that you could potentially spark a new idea by randomizing instead of following any sort of linear thought. Burroughs used this technique frequently in the 50s and 60s, and he would often cut up pieces of newspapers, magazines, and even his own work. Burroughs believed by doing this he was tapping into his subconscious. These juxtapositions between what you're thinking, if you're walking down the street, and what you see, that was exactly what I was introducing. You see, a lot of life is a cut-up, Every time you walk down the street or look out the window, your consciousness is cut by random factors, and then you begin to realise they're not so random, that this is saying something to you. Bowie subsequently adopted this technique when writing lyrics, and relied on it when he was low on ideas. Moonage Daydream is a perfect example of this technique being put to use. The first few lines of the song open as such. I'm an alligator. I'm a mama papa coming for you. I'm a space invader. I'll be a rock and rollin' bitch for you. Keep your mouth shut. You're squawking like a pink monkey bird. And I'm busting up my brain for the words. The first few lines to this song thus give off a sense of randomness. This is particularly shown in the first and third lines, with Bowie referring himself to an alligator in the former and the listener as a pink monkey bird in the latter. Despite the randomness of these lyrics, the overall message of the song is still conveyed, that message being the creation of the character Ziggy Stardust. Bowie also expresses his inability to find the right words to explain himself in the final lines with, I'm busting up my brain for the words. Perhaps this was a way to almost justify the seemingly random lyrics that came out of this series of cut-ups. In an interview conducted in the 1990s, Bowie expanded on his use of the cut-up technique, which he was continuing to use, but this time, thanks to the wonders of technology, he was able to use a computer to randomize instead of physically cutting up sources. I'll take articles out of newspapers, poems that I've written, pieces of other people's books, and put them all into this little warehouse, this container of information, and then hit the random button and it'll randomize everything. And I'll get reams of paper back out of it with interesting ideas, and then I'll either take sentences verbatim as it spews them out, or there might be something within a sentence which triggers off an idea. You know, science fiction has not been very successful. It was supposed to start a whole new trend, and nothing happened. For the special effects in some of the movies, like 2001, it was great, but it all ended there. I feel the same way. Now I'm doing Orwell's 1984 on television. That's a political thesis, and an impression of the way in another country. Something of that nature will have more impact on television. I don't believe in proper cinema. It doesn't have the strength of television. People having to go out to the cinema is really archaic. I'd much rather sit at home. Within this conversation on media, Bowie references his plans to adapt George Orwell's book 1984 to television, an adaptation which Bowie would call the 1980 Floor Show. The 1980 Floor Show was originally performed live at the Marquee Club in London Soho between October 18th to October 20th, 1973. The obvious wordplay in the title of the show would have its reasonings, and to understand them, we must go back a bit. As a child growing up in post-war Bromley, Bowie had read Orwell's 1984 and related the bleak and oppressive atmosphere of the book to the atmosphere in which he grew up in. You always felt you were in 1984. That's the kind of gloom and immovable society that a lot of us felt we grew up in. It was a terribly inhibiting place. After the success of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, Bowie wanted to adapt Orwell's 1984 into a musical. Lacking the legal rights to do so, Bowie got his manager to contact Orwell's widow to see whether she would be willing to grant Bowie the right to make his musical. Her immediate reaction to the suggestion of a musical was to deny Bowie the rights, and, according to Bowie in a 1993 interview, she said, "You've got to be out of your gourd. Do you think I'm turning this over to that as a musical?" Thus, the musical never came to be. However, Bowie did manage to create a thinly veiled live performance with 1984 undertones, which he humorously called the 1980 Floor Show. In the show, Bowie performed songs that would later feature on his upcoming album, an album that told the story of a dystopian and oppressive future. The album was called Diamond Dogs. Bowie would thus include many references to Orwell's books in Diamond Dogs, and particularly on the final stretch of the album in songs like 1984, Big Brother, and the 8th track off the album, We Are the Dead. We Are the Dead is structured around the love story between the two main characters in 1984, Winston and Julia. In 1984, Winston and Julia are criminals due to their relationship, and subsequently, they need to go to a hideout at the top of a shop to meet. In We Are the Dead, Bowie sings about the rebellious relationship from the perspective of Winston, as the lyrics talk about the love the narrator has for this girl, whilst lamenting the oppressive government that they have to hide from. Something kind of hit me today. I looked at you and wondered if you saw things my way. People will hold us to blame. It hit me today. It hit me today. Bowie also references the anti-government group in 1984 called the Brotherhood, which Winston and Julia both become members of during the second part of the book. When initially joining the Brotherhood, Winston and Julia meet with a man called O'Brien, who lays out the groundwork of their operation and the duties within it. "You understand," he said, "that you will be fighting in the dark. You will always be in the dark. You will receive orders and you will obey them, without knowing why." Bowie thus references Winston and Julia fighting against the government whilst in the dark, in the second verse. "We're taking it hard all the time. Why don't we pass it by? Just reply you've changed your mind. We're fighting with the eyes of the blind." For the remainder of the song, Bowie alludes to 1984 terms like doublethink and the 24-hour surveillance, reminiscent of Big Brother. In the final verse, Bowie paints a picture of the dystopian world outside the room in which Julia and Winston lie, finding some comfort in the two's you and me against the world type relationship. Bowie then ends the song with the scene in the book when Winston and Julia are captured. In this scene, the two characters are together in their hideout talking. As they stand looking at each other, Winston says, "We are the dead," and Julia repeats it back to him. This is followed by a robotic voice coming from a hidden telecom in the room saying, "You are the dead," and swiftly the couple are arrested by government officials. Bowie thus ends the song with Winston and Julia being arrested. His vocals sound accepting of the fate of the two characters as he sings these final lines. "Oh, dress yourself, my urchin one, for I hear them on the stairs. Because of all we've seen, because of all we've said, we are the dead." Beat Godfather meets Glitter Main Man. William Burroughs interviews David Bowie. This is the title given to the transcript of the entire conversation between Burroughs and Bowie, which was published in the February 28, 1974 issue of Rolling Stone. Burroughs and Kopetis had arrived at Bowie's house via taxi, and upon entering, waited for Bowie in his sci-fi infused living room. Kopetis describes the living room, making mention of a large painting that he described as being created by an artist whose style fell midway between Salvador Dali and Norman Rockwell. Bowie enters the room in three-tone NASA jodhpurs, and immediately the interview kicks off. Kopetis takes a back seat for the preceding 2 hours, and allows the conversation to flow. This video has included some of the topics of conversation this interview fell upon, and whilst there is more to what was said between the two men, I think the best place to conclude this video would be on the conversation about Bowie's lyrics. It didn't take long for Burroughs to start probing into this component of Bowie's music. Following a brief back and forth on the gigantic painting on the wall, Bowie's controlling nature, Ziggy Stardust, and lastly love and sexuality, Burroughs kickstarts the conversation on lyricism with a compliment. "Your lyrics are quite perceptive." Bowie responds to the compliment by stating his lyrics as being middle class, to which Burroughs further compliments Bowie's lyrics for being complicated, yet digestible to a mass audience. However, Bowie mentions how he doesn't believe that his audience listens to the words of his songs, and that if they were to sit down and read them, they would understand them in their own way, and sometimes a way exceeding Bowie's own understanding of them. "There have been times when I've written something, and it goes out, and it comes back in a letter from some kid as to what they think about it, and I've taken their analysis to heart so much that I have taken up his thing, writing what my audience is telling me to write." Following this, the two men discuss pulling ideas from dreams. The two men both agree on being frequent dreamers, and they both share a similarity of keeping something near their beds. The topic then turns to Bowie's inspiration. As for my inspiration, I haven't changed my views much since I was about 12. Really, I've just got a 12-year-old mentality. When I was in school, I had a brother who was into Kerouac, and he gave me On the Road to read when I was 12 years old. That's still been a big influence. Following a brief interjection by Copetus, who notes how Bowie and Burroughs share similarities in the images they convey, claiming them to be very graphic, almost comic booky in nature. Bowie begins to talk about his writing process, and says he writes in little vignettes, as anything else would be too much for him. The remainder of the interview swerves into external energy forces, then to pornography films, followed by the state of television, and lastly, to an awkward encounter Bowie recounts from when he met Andy Warhol. The interview thus ends on a small perceptive connection Burroughs makes about the weapons used by the characters in his 1971 book, The Wild Boys. The weapon of the Wild Boys is a Bowie knife, an 18-inch Bowie knife. Did you know that? An 18-inch Bowie knife? You don't do things by halves, do you? No, I didn't know that was their weapon. The name Bowie just appealed to me when I was younger. I was into a kind of heavy philosophy thing when I was 16 years old, and I wanted a truism about cutting through the lies and all that. Well, it cuts both ways, you know, double-edged on the end. I didn't see it cutting both ways till now. The literary influences of David Bowie remained until the very end. What is interesting about Bowie's interview with Burroughs is that Burroughs directly asked him whether his inspirations were literary, to which Bowie responded, "I don't think so." Maybe being asked this on the spot enticed a non-committal answer from Bowie, as Bowie had evidently referenced and used elements of books in his own work. Maybe to him, Bowie didn't feel as if books ignited inspiration more than they left a lasting influence on his way of being and how he tried to convey it. Regardless, books evidently played a role in helping Bowie create his music, whether it was through adopting the language of Nadsat, pulling from the creative techniques of Burroughs, or adapting a work into a different medium. Bowie had looked to literature when trying to build the worlds in which his characters would reside. And this would not just be occasionally, he continued to do so throughout his career, right up into his final album, Black Star, an album which told the story of Bowie's death. Thus, the works he read definitely had their impact throughout David Bowie's 60-year-long career, and these books would pervade the lyrics Bowie wrote, the characters he crafted, and the worlds he built through his music, right up into his dying day.